Thank you very much. So hi, everyone, and welcome to our third session in the virtual stage ACJS Faculty Development Workshop. Today, we're going to be covering teaching about social justice in 2021 with Joanne Belknap. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica Miller, and I'm the sponsoring editor for Criminology and Criminal Justice List. And I'm joining you today from my home office just outside of Houston. Also on the call today from Stage is Josh Perigo, our acquisitions editor for the discipline. So if you have any great ideas about the next best textbook, he's your person to reach out to. We are thrilled that you're joining us here today. At Sage, we believe that a commitment to research and education empowers researchers, educators, and institutions to shape the future for a better society. We support that in three key ways: teaching and learning, research methods, and by supporting the social and behavioral sciences. When it comes to criminology and criminal justice, SAGE is dedicated to providing instructors like yourselves with high quality content and resources like this webinar series. We know that these can be trying and chaotic times for both you and your students, and we want to be there to support you every step of the way, sharing our vision for a better future. This workshop is important to us, and we look forward to supporting it for many more years to come, regardless of the format. And we're thrilled that you're here today or watching a recording of this session. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our amazing workshop coordinator, distinguished scholar himself, and author of White Collar Crime, Brian Payne, to introduce today's speaker.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. It's so great to be here again this month with all of you. Hope you've been able to join others, and if not, hope you'll join. Continue to join today. Obviously today and into the future. We're so happy today to have Professor Joanne Belknap, who is a professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado, and she was a former president of the American Society of Criminology. She's also an adjunct professor on faculty of law at Queensland University of Technology School of Justice in Brisbane, Australia. Her research is focused primarily on gender-based abuse and the trajectory of trauma to offending among women and youth, the intersections of marginalization and oppression and social justice. She's working on a 5th edition of her book, The Invisible Woman, Gender, Crime, and Justice, and certainly be on the watch for that. It's an amazing book that I know people found quite useful in various types of classes. And in addition to some pioneering research and numerous federal grants that she's received, she's also served the community and the policy arena and encouraging us to use our opportunities to advocate for what's right and what's appropriate in using social justice to inform policy. I especially remember the opportunity. She was at ODU once years ago, and she was finishing her term as the ASC president, and I was finishing mine as ACJS president. We got to have conversations with our graduate students, and they were essentially surprised that I think that neither of us really liked doing those sorts of things. And we had some great war stories that we shared, and I know she's going to share some excellent insight with you today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Joanne. So thank you for doing this again, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Brian and Jessica. And as I told people, for everybody who knows I'm awkward in person, it's 10,000 times more in Zoom and now in Team One, which I'm not really used to. So I hope that you will feel free to let me know if anything that isn't making sense on here. Let's see. I try to find my, oh, there we go, sorry. My PowerPoint here. I told Jessica to please feel free to ask me questions while I'm talking here, and if I don't see them, if Jessica, you can let me know what they are, and then I'm also gonna put a little timer on my phone to make sure we have 15 minutes at the end. I made these I'm happy to send these slides to anybody who wants them, or my syllabus. I don't know if you had, I sent them to you, Jessica, just a few hours ago. But just to tell you a little bit about this, I wrote a proposal in the summer of 2016 to have, and I'm happy to share that if anybody wants it. I don't think it's the world's greatest proposal, and probably a better one could be made now, but to my university to have an intro to social justice class. And I've taught it 3 times on campus, the first time with 70 students, the second time with 120, and then last fall with 136 students. I had 1 TA the first time and 2 the second and third times, and the third time was last fall, so it was Zoom. I love teaching this class, and I've learned so much doing it. I've also taught it 3 times in the Inside Out Prison Exchange program, which I imagine some people on here have taught in that program, where there's 16 inside prisoner students and 16 outside CU undergraduate students. And I taught it a little differently than I am an ethnic studies, but as a feminist, I don't really know how you can teach anything in the social sciences or humanities without intersectionality, but I just want to point out intersectionality was just really key to teaching about social justice. So I'm going to talk about this as my class, Introduction to Social Justice, but also kind of teaching about social justice, both of those things. And in every class, I really try to just routinely have intersections of race, gender, class, and sexuality. And then I made, you'll see in here, I had special foci on immigrants and people with disabilities as some other things. So one of the questions for me is, how is social justice different than criminal justice? And then how is social justice different than social problems, which I hadn't really thought of the second question here until one of my colleagues and I, Nick Villanueva, have been working on writing a book on social justice, a textbook. And we provided Jessica Miller with kind of our outline and what we thought it would be. And she very appropriately emailed back, how is this different than a social problems class? And I was like, oh, wait. And so I'm going to also share with you the PowerPoint from my first class that I teach when I do the intro, that has a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about in here, but include this kind of looking at how is this different than criminal justice. And so one of the things that I do think what I do is look at social problems, but then through a lens of how that is related to the criminal legal system, the criminalizing of people, and but also what are their ways of acquiring justice, and that aren't necessarily through the criminal legal system, that it can be with changing government programming, changing public schools, school funding, school rules, healthcare provisions, and those kinds of things. So that's how I am seeing it. So over time, the topics, they've been pretty much the same since the first time of the 6 times I've taught it. But when I first started, I started with, introduction, but then the topics here. I started with housing justice, but the more that I was including things on colonization and indigenous rights and so on, I changed this to housing and land justice, and that has worked out really, really well to look at sort of the historical about colonizing, but also of colonization, but also then of how that impacts things today. And then from there going into education justice and then work justice. One of the biggest surprises to me was somebody had said to me when I was designing it the first time, be sure you do food justice, which I hadn't thought of doing, but then I did all this reading on it. And at the end of the first semester that I taught it, I asked the class what was their biggest surprise about the class and any kind of feedback, since it was the first time I taught it. It was the time I had 70 students and I was teaching it on campus. And almost everybody said they were surprised how interesting food justice ended up being to them. And then I do disability justice and then healthcare justice, immigrant justice. And one of the reasons the disability and immigrant, in addition to the other forms of intersectionality that are topics within that, like race, class, gender, sexuality, that I do that is the students don't tend to have as much information on those, and I don't think there is as much information on those as there are race, class, gender, and sexuality. And certainly immigrant justice has been hugely important forever, but in very recent years. And then environmental justice. The first time I taught it, in addition to them telling me that they were surprised how much they liked the food justice part, the biggest area that they said that they thought I had missed was doing bullying. And there was quite a bit that semester in the news about bullying, but and I teach a whole class on violence against women and girls, so I kind of thought, oh, well, I don't really want to do a gender-based abuse thing. But then I started thinking, no, it is, especially since a lot of hate crimes aren't reported and all that sort of thing, and bullying. So I added that as another section to it. At the end, if I have time, I include transportation justice. I usually end up behind by that point, but so don't cover it as much, but it is actually, I think, a very interesting point as well. But obviously all of you who are criminologists can see how all of these are related to criminal justice and certainly social problems. All of my classes that are on depressing topics, I like to end with an empowering week about what is going on, and so looking at what, and even then, though throughout it, I'll also give examples of what are some kind of cool community organizations that are doing, or some laws that were passed. So I'll talk about those kinds of things. But the last week is just to present some specific studies on social justice activism from all these things that we talked about all semester. In the banner there, you can see that two of the significant themes that emerged from the very first time I was teaching this, and it is kind of interesting because sometimes they become, in certain classes, they'll be more important than others, or play a bigger role, but they always play a big role, is this whole idea of the body and bodies and embodiment. And it's really powerful to talk about that, and certainly talking about like things like how bodies, are raced. I have when I talk about some of the healthcare justice, one of the things I talk about is the Fiji Islands, where these girls all ended up who had never had eating disorders, had all these eating disorders after US and British TB was implemented there, and how they saw their bodies. So that's just an example of that, and looking at how bodies are looked at differently. I talk a lot about fat phobia. One person that whose work I really like, and I show a clip of her, oh God, I just forgot her name, Roxanne Gay, does great stuff on fat phobia and fat oppression. And so I've used clips from her, and that students have really liked that, about just talking about people's how much we weight what people look like, in addition to what color skin people have, with people with disabilities, people who are fat, and so on. So that's been really powerful. And then space and place, and that's been important in the Inside Out classes when I taught it in there, that to have a college class that's in a prison, and thinking that isn't a place we think about having college classes, but also just with space and place. And you'll see this in my first set of PowerPoints that I have for the introduction to the class, but just looking about how we do and don't feel like we belong in different places and spaces depending on our characteristics. And then after that, these are just some of the statements I have in my syllabus, because when I talked with Brian and Jessica yesterday, they were talking about what are some of the things that have come up with that you want to be able to do and think about. And the class is extremely interdisciplinary. And it's teaching it. I'm not sure I've ever read as much to teach a class as I have this one, that I have spent so much time preparing the lectures, because realizing that I really didn't know a whole lot about healthcare, a whole lot about education, transportation, environmental justice. so these are just some of the statements I have on it. It's an interdisciplinary class that critically examines injustices in social systems such as education, healthcare systems, housing, which can lead to criminalization. Topics are examined through the lenses of oppression, power distributed by race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, and other types of marginalization. My goal as your professors to produce an environment where we can learn the most, question assumptions, and creatively and critically discuss and develop the ideas and strategies I want in the classroom to be where we can dialogue, be respectful, and sometimes even have fun, but these topics can be depressing. I all the time include, and I pretty much have this in almost everything I teach, something at this second paragraph that I just read that you're seeing there, because I do, like most of us, most of my class, even research methods can end up being that we're talking about research on a troubling topic. So talking about it in that way. So some of the ground rules that I made years ago for all of my classes, you can see here are this. One is that it's never okay to ask somebody if they are a survivor or victim of something. And I'm sure other people in here have had this happen. I have it happen more when I first started teaching in the 1980s, but it is kind of surprising sometimes how students can do that. And the other thing was never asking somebody in the class to talk on behalf of an entire group of people. I had that happen to me all the time in graduate school, to talk on behalf of women, which including in countries I had never been to. And so I've always felt like those are sort of key, and maybe some of you have better ways of stating this than I do. So one of the other suggestions I have, and I hadn't done, I used to do this thing where I just kind of sometimes would say, why are you taking the class, and just have them write this. And most of my large classes, I do quizzes every week, but quizzes often in quotation marks. Some of them are the actual quizzes on the readings that are, and then some would be like writing a letter to a guest speaker. And then because I have big classes, I don't like having to deal with makeup quizzes, so I always tell everybody they can drop their 5 lowest quizzes, but that means that you don't get, that's it. That's very generous to let you drop 5, and that's all I'm doing. And so don't tell me you had a flat tire and, you know, blah, 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 and all the other reasons. So one of my former honors students, Dr. Kelly Brown, who received her PhD a year ago from UC Berkeley in American Studies. I was talking to her last summer, and she had a class on Black Lives Matter that she had to suddenly, I think there were like 25 students, she had to suddenly change from in-person to Zoom. And so she had told me about the survey she did, and it's really great for these kind of classes. And I think for just talking about social justice too. And so the quiz for the first week is that they fill this out, and then and so everybody gets the 10 points or however much it's worth. But one thing is asking them what kind of topics they hope are going to be addressed, and by them they've all seen the syllabus, so they can see what we're doing. But it can kind of help me if there's something that I hadn't actually that I didn't have in there. Do I want to figure out a way of making an extra lecture on that or whatever? Why they signed up for the class, what they hope to get out of it, and any concerns they have about the class, and anything they want the TAs or me to know about them. And this last thing I think is the most important thing, because a lot of, after I did this, I thought, shoot, I would do this in my graduate classes in the future too, no matter what the topic. Like, because a lot of people would say things like, you know, my dad is dying of cancer, this is going to be a hard semester for me, or I have cancer, or I was sexually assaulted over the summer. It's really surprising, some of the stuff they'll put, or I have a really bad learning disability that's, and even though they have to fill out all of their stuff with disability services and so on. But it can also be like, I don't like doing chat rooms. They make me really, they give me a lot of anxiety, or not chat rooms, you know, the breakout rooms or whatever. But I really, really like this because they feel that they have this place that they've heard. And then I know this thing, even in these big classes, which it is a lot of work going through and reading all, but then I make these notes on, you know, who is having some kind of trauma going on currently or that they're recovering from. Guest speakers for this class, like any class, students love a really good guest speaker. The section on work, I have one of my friends who's a former sex worker, and it was so, the students love having her come and talk. And I always pay my guest speakers because I just feel like I'm getting paid to do this job and they're helping me do it. And I'm happy to recommend her to anybody, but I would say that she's really great, and she's a Korean American woman, and she's in her 50s. I always wish she'd gotten a PhD. She's just brilliant, and but she does this great rundown on sex work as work, intersectionality of it, the risks with it, but also how some of the laws with sex trafficking have actually taken away a lot of sex workers' rights and independence. And it's super, super powerful. Plus, she's hysterically funny. She's really great. We have this organization in Colorado, and I was looking online yesterday. I don't know how many. It looks like some other places have it, but it's called Prisoners Against Crime, where prisoners do talks and will come to high schools or college classes or whatever. And so I've had them come in every time, which I couldn't do during the pandemic. But that's been super powerful, and they know the classes on social justice. And since I have taught the Inside Out classes there, some of them I know, but they will talk about some of the social justice issues. But they're instructed, in at least in the Colorado Prisoners Against Crime program, to talk about that they don't make excuses for why they committed the crime, but they want people to know what their lives were like. And those have been really, really powerful for class too. Some of the films I've used that have been great. Oh, sorry, yeah.
No, that's right. Before we go on to talk about films, we did have a question in the chat just for, do you have like a range of how much you would typically pay a guest speaker?
You know what, I usually pay them $100, and part of it is I make a lot. I mean, I feel like I make enough money that I can afford to do that. And that's just, I pay them that no matter who they are, whether there's somebody who doesn't have any college, and some of my friends will trade off with each other, and, I don't pay them that are other professors and stuff like that, and they don't, and people, but to me, I've always felt like this thing, like guest speakers are doing us a really big favor to come and talk to our classes. So that's, I think I used to pay $75 for years, and before that $50, and I kind of did it no matter how long they talked. Whether they came as a panel, and before that I would do things like bring them, I didn't think of this for years. Like I do things like have coffee brought in, and buy flowers or some kind of something from my university to give them as and so they certainly don't mean to be, but to me it's part of all of this justice part, and especially when it is somebody who like my friend who's a sex worker is or was a sex worker. She has a disabled child that, well, is an adult now, but does not have a college education, all this stuff, people who've been in prison before, a lot of those folks. So that's what I do. And I tell my students that too. I just want you to know I pay my guest speakers, and then I also give them a whole thing on how to treat guest speakers and all that stuff. But the students are great. I mean, I always feel like these kind of guest speakers, the people that have been in prison or are currently in prison, or my friend that's the sex worker, former sex worker, that they provide so much more than any of the PhD people I've had come in and talk. They've just been so powerful for people, and so yeah, so that's what I do. That was a long-winded answer. Yeah, and I can't see the chat, so please do tell me if any more questions that come in.
Will do.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I love the film Who Killed Vincent Chin. A lot of people don't know about it, and it's such an important case, and the quality of the film is not great, but students really, really like it, and and as most of you know, it's really hard to find really great work on the people of Asian descent in the United States. And this is such an important case from Detroit that went to the courts, and is really good at looking at immigrants, is good at looking at work, because it's these unemployed automobile workers in Michigan, and looking at racism, and looking at the criminal legal system, and looking at how the people of Asian descent, the community organizing they did around this, because if you don't know about this case, he was these two white men, a father and stepson, killed him with a baseball bat. It's horrible. The night he was having before he was getting married in Detroit, and they were at a strippers bar, and the sex workers in the bar ended up playing real key roles in the when it went to federal court too. So that part's really interesting. But it's a really good way, I feel like, again, of looking at the social justice as well as the criminal legal system justice. My Spanish is terrible. Maquilapolis is about the factories that are in Mexico that are owned by most of the United States, some like Canada and Europe, the factories that make products for mostly people in the United States or Canada or Europe. And it's almost all women that work at them. And and I showed this one towards the end of the semester, so it's really good to look at work justice, to look at like this international part, but also the way these women are exploited. And then the Mexican government goes along with it about like not paying them very much, violating their own laws. And then the environmental justice of the conditions that they're working in, or the conditions where they have to live. A lot of the women are single parents, but it's a great movie, a great documentary, and it's fairly recent, and it shows the women organizing too for their own rights, and so that's really empowering too. I've had a hard time for years finding documentaries on disability in general, but especially disability justice, that were not only on white people. It was just kind of amazing how, and so sometimes I would show them and then talk about this is really problematic. Fixed, I really like. The science fiction of human enhancement is really great, again, for looking at like things about space and place, and these ideas about not only like people who are born with disabilities or acquire disabilities because of accidents or multiple sclerosis or something like that. And again, the stuff about bodies here is really fascinating. And the students really get into it. And it starts with somebody in a wheelchair, this underwater doing scuba diving. And it's just beautiful photography. But I love this one. And then, like I said, I show lots of little clips of things like Roxane Gay, who's just amazing. And she's also very openly bisexual and talks about queer issues really well too, and was born in Haiti. I usually hate group projects.
I'm sorry, we had another question about film come through. So the question was just around, how films can be a really great way to engage students, especially with topics like social justice or criminal justice. The question was, is there a risk that students may relive a traumatic experience?
Yeah, that is a great point.
What are some ways you could address or avoid that if you want to include films in your class?
Yeah, that is a great point. One of the things that I always feel like, I don't want to show too many films during class because I feel like, am I wasting their tax dollars because they can watch, or their tuition dollars because they can watch this at home? But then there's this other part, especially before the pandemic, I feel like there is something very powerful about a collective watching a documentary together. I do this thing, and I'll show you in the next set of slides on trigger warnings, and I will tell people, if you are upset by something, just don't watch. Feel free to get out, or if you know beforehand you don't want to do this, then just, if you can let me or one of the TAs know, so I know that's why you're not watching it. One of the other films I use in the social justice classes, from the Eyes on the Prize series, I have a certain section of it I tell them to watch. And probably everybody's aware of the Eyes on the Prize series. The original one was 6 different videos, and then they made some other ones later. But I think the 6 ones are really good. But I show from the first one to Emmett Till's murder, and but it is like major trigger warning, because I tell them you will see Emmett Till's lynched body, and it is gruesome and it's horrific. And so I will do this stuff on trigger warnings. I'll go into that in a minute when I show my slides from my first class. So I do tell them, I need, you signed up for this class, but I also need you to take care of yourself if you know this is going to be really hard. The other thing that I have had happen frequently, as probably many of you have, is having somebody who repressed being a child sexual abuse survivor. They have repressed it until the class, or thought, oh, I'm handling it fine, and then are not handling it so fine. So I talk a lot about that, and I have it in my syllabus too. If you need to drop the class because of this or take an incomplete, let me know sooner than later. And you don't really have to tell me why. We'll just figure it out. But that is a huge issue, teaching about these topics. I usually hate group projects because everybody has the same problem. You have the students that do all the work and the students that don't do any work. But they really wanted us in the Inside Out program. The group projects were great. I've had that's the best I've ever had them work. But when I taught Intro to Social Justice last fall with 136 students, the university was really trying to encourage us, especially in freshman person classes, to do group projects so they could meet each other. And it was a huge amount of work to organize them, because I let them pick their own topics and organize around them. But I have to say they did an amazing job. And I can talk more about that at the rubric that I used for that, but they did. And the ones in the prison were always great too. But students just came, they made, like, one of the things I show in here too, some of you might have seen this, is this short little video, cartoon video on YouTube called Consent Tea, which is a great analogy about don't make somebody drink tea if they don't want to, or if they start to drink tea and then they change their mind. So it's this analogy about consensual sex. And so I told them, we're going to watch that, and that I don't expect you to do something of that quality, but you could do a PowerPoint show or something like that. And some of them did just these amazing projects. So I have to say, on really different topics. So that was really cool. These are the required readings that I've used and that the students, I think, have really liked. I've used, I'm not going to say the ones I didn't like, because I feel like that's mean, and in case any of the authors are on here too, but this Reina Grande, The Distance Between Us and Memoir, and she's actually willing to talk to classes too if you give her enough notice, which I didn't, but is really great for looking at immigration. And she talks about being, she's from Mexico, and her parents migrating from Mexico to California to make enough money, and being raised by, it's not a big book, but it's really, really good. She also wrote this book called Across 100 Mountains, which is really good, but that's fiction, which I've used that in some other classes would be good. But this is the students, I felt like, especially ones that didn't have much understanding of Latinx immigrants, it really gave them a very personal way of looking at this. City of Inmates is one of my all-time favorite books ever. I used this one for the first time last semester because Keisha Middlemass's book, which the students have also loved, Convicted and Condemned, wasn't available electronically, and they wanted us to use ebooks during the pandemic. So the City of Inmates, if you haven't read it, is just one of the things that is, it's just a fantastic historical book on how we got to where we are today with the criminal legal system and the mass incarceration and so on. But it's also just so great about how she deals with race, and starting with colonization, and it's about Los Angeles, but and then going through and looking at people of Asian descent, Chinese people in particular, exploitation, and then incarceration, and indigenous people, of white male hobos, Latinx folks, and Mexican, and other immigrants, and people who weren't immigrants, and Latinx folks who weren't immigrants, and then the Great Migration of African Americans from the South out, and just who gets targeted to make prisons huge. And it's really great, but I feel like it gives students, I learned so much when I read this book, but it gives them this really great historical accounting of how we are so messed up around all of this, and then American Poison. And then these two articles are really good. This one on Ubuntu is just this great idea of bodies and disability, and looking at bodies in this other way, that a disability is a good thing. I mean, it's that each body is unique and special and offers this sort of thing. And students really like this article. And then this one on the in the New Yorker is really great about chicken plants in the United States, and students really like this one too. So that's why I wanted to put those ones in there. Okay, I'll do the question and the answers, but first I'm gonna go back to to show you my the first slides that I use that will answer some of these other questions too. Okay, so this is, and I'm happy, I sent these to Jessica, but this one I can just kind of show you. I always try to start out with my classes saying I want everybody to do well in my class. I'm not, and this just to show that this was showing them the survey that they were going to take. And so this is part of what, like Jessica and Brian were telling me yesterday, people just really liked ideas of how to do this. So we'll self-reflect as well as learn from research, document and reason each other. And so here, if you're feeling overwhelmed with the content or keeping up, please talk to me or one of the TAs. And I'll tell them, if you're more comfortable talking to a TA than me, that's fine. Use one of the TAs, and the TA can kind of keep me informed what's going on. That we really do need to recognize the pain of victimization of our own and or other groups. And then part of it, as we all know, you can have that white student who gets very defensive, feels like everybody's mad at them. Sometimes they are, or blamed, but talking about, and so I'll do a thing on just talking about not, oh God, I just forgot the name of it, about white fragility. So I'll talk about that sometimes. And I've just found it's much better to just openly do this from the beginning. And I tell them, you know, that some of the ground rules are this, and again, I don't do this just in this, my social justice class, I do this in pretty much every class, but talk about politically correct, that I just got so tired of that, like somehow it's politically correct is somehow oppressing people not to be able to be harassing, disrespectful, and use microaggressions. So I go through and kind of talk about all of that. Like I like, if we know that people learn better when they're not being harassed, disrespected, and microaggressed, which we do, why would we not teach that way, as well as just basic human decency? And then I just talk about language, why that's important. I just and we'll go through that, about that, some of this. So and then I did for the first time last fall semester, but I think the history of this is kind of interesting, and looking at this little this source that it was in the New York Times that they talked about the origin of BIPOC. And then again, every class I have this thing on trauma triggers, and I said, you know, there's a lot of people who want to make fun of these and talk about, you know, college students being snowflakes and whatsoever, but it is real. We know this. The research again shows that people can get triggered, and PTSD can get triggered. So, and then I also always like to have little citations so they know I'm not making it all up. And I always tell my students, if you want the original PDF of the article, I'll send it to you, or tell you which book it came from, and you can order or check out from the library. But then here is also, be sure you need to take care of yourself. And if you realize from this first class, this may not be for you, you know, that there's nothing wrong with that. And then I also have all these places for that in the syllabus. I have both on and off campus, usually places where they can get assistance. And then again, talking about if you need to drop the course, let me know sooner than later, because it's a lot harder later. Then with, I know I'm talking like a mile a minute here. So then with this, I go through like social justice and where this has come, that, you know, it isn't a brand new phenomenon. But kind of talking about the history of some of looking at this, and looking at John Rawls, and then defining it in these ways, like here about full participation. And so again, I sent these slides to Jessica, if anybody, so I have my whole first lecture here that usually does take at least a week to get through, because it's pretty long. And then I really like Dunbar's overlapping goals of social justice. so this is all, the first week of class, and actually the first day of class we get to this after we go over the kind of course, the syllabus and all that stuff. But the other thing I do a lot of times, and partly because, when I started teaching in the 1980s, we didn't have that word trigger warnings or triggers or all that stuff. And one time, God, this was probably 10 years ago, but I was teaching, and I told the students, I will make mistakes. I will forget to tell you there's a trigger warning. I'm going to try to remember to do that. And like one of the things I do is I'll tell them I'm going to wave my hands to say when you can start listening again, if you want to put your hands over your ears. But because I do, for my own research, have some really horrible, real stories to tell, but they're going to be in the movies and everything too. But, with these, the other thing I do is when I talk about microaggressions and implicit bias and it is impossible for us not to do this in our society. We have all been so ingrained. Some of us are going to do it more than others based on our lenses that we've been raised with. But I said, if I will likely make a microaggression over the semester, or I will say something that I will not mean, because we know most microaggressions are not meant to be hurtful. And much of the implicit bias, of course, there is that, which is meant to be racist, sexist, and so on. But I say, if I do this, please let me know. And if you feel like you are worried that I'm going to, be upset with you, then leave a note in my mailbox or tell the TA or to tell me. And then most of the time when I do this, I've never asked my students to do this, but I will tell this, my TAs almost always will say, yeah, same with me. If ever I do anything that's upsetting to you, please, let me know. So that's helpful. And then I just have this little quote from Aristotle. And then I go on and look at all of this and okay. And so I see I finished just a little bit early, which is so unlike me. But again, you can look through this, but the insiders outsiders things is always like an othering and looking at how race is defined. So I go through this whole thing about the social construction of race and gender and sex and then measuring class. And there's a great book of racial bias in healthcare, but she does a really great job on implicit racial bias and how many people of color, BIPOC folks, are killed every year from implicit racial bias. But it's also a great book. At the end of it, she talks about how it doesn't have to be this way because most of the medical field doesn't realize they're doing this. So those are just, again, I go through a bunch of this and just good news about we can unlearn implicit bias, default discrimination, these different things, and then talk about the difference between races, intersectionality. These are always those great slides. Students love stuff like that. And then this one's kind of fun. I made this up myself, but I heard this on an NPR thing. The main characteristics most people organize around are stereotypes around age, gender, and race. And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with this. It's when you're discriminating against on it. So who would you ask to help move the couch? There's nothing wrong with not asking a baby to move a couch or people with a disability in a wheelchair. Who would you ask for directions? There's no reason, you're not going to ask the baby directions. Who would you ask if you needed a menu? So again, the baby wouldn't get a menu. Who has an extra tampon? It's not wrong to not ask a man for a tampon. So those just kind of give you some ideas of how I do that. So I'll turn it over to questions now and get out of the sharing here.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. And as Joanne mentioned, I do have copies of those slides. I'll make sure those get shared around with the group along with the recording of the session that'll be sent out within the next week or so. We have had a couple questions come in. So Jane said, I noticed you make a distinction between criminal legal system versus criminal justice system, as it's often called. Do you care to explain why you prefer this term?
Yeah, thank you. From the very first edition of my book, this great book by Stuart Scheingold, oh God, I can't remember the name of it. It came out in 1984. He kept calling he didn't say why he did it, but throughout this book on the law, he kept using the criminal processing system. And I was like, oh, and I feel like everything I teach and research and volunteer about is how often the system is not just. And I always tell my students or anybody that'll listen to me, most defendants, victims, complainants, most people do not feel like the system is just as they are going through it. So it's not just, just offenders or just victims, and so calling it the criminal legal system is a way to say this is this. So I first started calling it the criminal processing system after consistent with what Stuart Sheingold did for those reasons, because so often it's not just. And then when other people, and I can't remember who started using the criminal legal system, and then I started doing that. So that's why I always tell my students, even though I have a master's and PhD in criminal justice, I talk about the criminal legal system, not the criminal justice system, because we have a lot of problems with it. And there's that's me. But there's other people that do that too. But that's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. Stacy asked, can you please talk a little bit more about food justice and what topics you may cover in relation to the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so the food justice, it is really interesting because, like I said, the students were surprised, and I was surprised when I started looking at it. So part of it is talking about things like the social justice part, about things like food deserts, the parts of mostly in cities where the place where the poorest people live, which of course is going to be correlated with BIPOC folks, is where the big grocery stores are no longer there, and then there'll be smaller stores that don't have as healthy and fresh food and that sort of thing. So talking about things like food deserts, but then also talking about the production of food. And so that article that I talked about, the New Yorker one by James Garber, and talking about working in the chicken factories in the United States by mostly Latinx people. But in this article, they talk about a lot of people of Asian descent, immigrants are now a lot of who's working in those too. So looking at the conditions people are working under, especially if they are not documented. And then, but then like one of the things I do in my PowerPoint slide is about this banana production company in Costa Rica and how much they're polluting the ground there. That the bananas that are coming mostly to the United States are just fine when they test those for chemicals and stuff. The chemicals that they're using to grow the bananas there aren't going into the bananas, but they are going into the soil and into the water in Costa Rica. So looking at this food justice in that way. But then I also talk about the Black Panther Party doing the school lunch programs when the Black Panther Party first started. And those have actually, the history of that is fascinating, which is something I think I didn't even know about until about 10 years ago. And a lot of places that have been implemented school lunch programs, it was replicating what the Black Panthers had done, although Hoover looked at this as this, communist. They were trying to indoctrinate the kids and just did all this stuff to stop that. So looking at the food justice in those ways about then how do we make sure everybody does have equal access to healthy food but in terms of working it into the criminal legal system, it does get a little bit dicey, except for things like talking about, if you can make legislation around this. Like another one I talk about, which isn't food justice, is like this battery plant in California that is just horrible environmental repercussions for the people that live around it. So that doesn't really answer the food thing, but that's what I try to look at with that. But also how things like Ronald Reagan's counting ketchup as a vegetable in school lunches, and that you can have this kind of legislation that does that, and how do we try to change that?
Great. Amy had a question. She's asking if you have any recommendations regarding having a social justice class as a service learning class.
I think that would be a fabulous idea. I would love to do that, and then have people, whether they're volunteering at a homeless shelter, they could just so many places, a food bank, and I think that would be a fantastic idea. I think that would be really, really great. And one of the things that was just so interesting to me was I gave the students these lists, and I'm happy to send this to you too, of the like for doing the group projects, of just kind of what they could do, like some potential topics. And they, a lot of people got into the voting rights, and in fact, a number of groups picked to do that, and they did a great job on that. But it was because some of them were volunteering and trying to get people registered to vote. And so I think it would be fantastic to do this as a service learning class.
All right, it looks like we have 2 more questions that we should have time to get to. So one, Marilyn just said there's so much good information and knowledge in education. It's inspiring, but a little overwhelming at the same time for those who are new to teaching. So she's asking, what would you say the bottom line to effectively teaching social justice or similar subjects? She said, would you say the bottom line to effectively teaching social justice or similar subjects is to be open to learning from our mistakes, our students, and building on knowledge as we gain more experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, one of the things I tell my students are some of the microaggressions I've done or dumb things I've done. Then I always make this joke to them, like, there's my 136 most intimate friends, let me tell you about this time that I did this thing that I did not realize was horrible. And I tell them partly because I said I don't want to spend the rest of my life feeling guilty about that. I want to learn from what I did from this. And so I do feel like that is true. And when Breonna Taylor's verdict came out last fall, it was during my social justice class, and I just felt like I had to have a class specifically on that. And it was really awkward doing it on Zoom, and it was one of those kind of teaching nightmares where some of the students were getting really mad at some of the other students, and I felt like, it was one of those things I could see. It was just very, very awkward. But I also tell students, and one of the things I said for years in all the teaching I've been doing, is I think the single thing that we're the worst talking about in college classes and outside of college classes in the United States is about racism, because we live in many of us live in very racially segregated lives, and so we're not good at talking about it. But if we can't talk about racism in college classes, that's really a bad thing. So we are going to talk about it, and we are going to make mistakes, but we're going to do it. And that one ended up being super heavy, as it would be, but it was so. But I think part of it too is, like, I always tell, I don't want everybody to come in here and feel guilty about everything in the whole world, unless you really are just a horrible bigot, which I'm assuming you're not, because you wouldn't be taking this class, or sexist or whatever. But that you are wanting to learn this, and how can we do better at all of this?
Okay, I think that's actually a good segue into our other question from Gabriel. He asked, what is your take on the Trump administration putting racism, discrimination, and white supremacists at the front of mainstream discussion? Did that end up being a positive action for America or not?
I feel like it has been. I cannot believe, like, to hear Joe Biden talking about white supremacy, and hear like things like NASCAR drivers talk about Black Lives Matter. I mean, I never in my day thought any of this was going to happen. And so I mean, obviously, I can't stand Trump, and the damage is irreparable, what he's done in so many levels. That there has been this other awakening, and I feel like people, the United States has just been terrible about our own history. I just came from a lunch for ethnic studies. We're trying to recruit somebody to come here, and we were just talking about how we learned so little about slavery, about colonization in the United States. Our education is just so racist and sexist too, like just not learning about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and different things like that. But to me, this has been, as horrible as this last few years has been, to have white supremacy be something that we're seeing all the time being called out. To me, it's just hugely positive, and to talk about colonization more regularly. I mean, I was just telling them I turned 63 last weekend, and I had to take Colorado history as in the 70s in high school in Colorado. We never once learned about colonization, about the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. you know, we didn't learn about the Japanese internment camps in Colorado. And so I feel like for part of it is this whole thing of learning our history and how we are, you know, we may not be responsible, me, for what happened, you know, 100 years ago and, you know, 70 years ago, but I am responsible for being a citizen that is trying to focus on equality and equity, and trying to make it a better place. So, and I love the students. I feel like they've just gotten more exciting to me over the years. I just think I mean, there's some jerks, but most of them, I don't know. It might be my white hair, but I just don't have as much flack as I did before from people just saying ridiculous things in classes anymore.
A positive thing to hear. And then I think we have one other question to get in here. So Frank asked, what would you suggest as a means to inject this topic in smaller morsels in other classes, such as policing, intro, and corrections?
I think, like with policing, I do think the thing about obviously race and gender, but about bodies too, like how bodies are viewed and validated, and who is allowed to, you know, why is this that it is mostly Black men and certainly Black women and brown bodies, and you know, why is this, when we look at this, how this is justified, and how is this related to a legacy of slavery? And like one of Patricia Osen has this great article about women's prisons, and about the places that still require women to incarcerated women giving birth in shackles, you know, that how starkly visual that is to slavery. And so to me, like, there's these ways, you know, and again, even when I'm teaching research methods classes, that to talk about this, like, this is this research on this, what is this finding here? I'm like really amazed at, like, when I did the Roxane Gay clip about a lot of women talking about hating their own bodies and having, you know, eating disorders, and just having transformations around that too. So I hope that makes sense. One of the things I did want to say too is I feel like part of doing the social justice, comparing it to the criminal justice, is looking at what are these structural things that we have, and the individual things that happen from them, the community things that happen from them, but what are these structural forces that result in these problems that we have in the criminal legal system, and that's why I like Keisha Middlemass's book, Convicted and Condemned, and getting out of the criminal legal system, and she talks about having a felony record as a social disability, and it's really powerful how she does that, and she's great. She's come and talked to my classes too. She's fantastic. When I used her book, and then she's come zoomed into my classes, and it's just amazing.
Perfect. Well, we are at time, perfect to the minute. So thank you so much, Dr. Belknap. We really appreciate you making time for this, and just sharing your thoughts on this. And as mentioned, I will send out a recording of this, as well as the resources that Dr. Belknap shared. For those of you who did attend, I know I sent the link to the survey in the reminder for this session, but please do make sure you fill out that survey so that I can get those certificates together and get those sent off within the next few weeks. And look forward to seeing you guys at our next session with Dr. Jacinta Gao to talk about teaching policing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for everybody for your patience too, because I was kind of fast paced there. Thank you.